Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English, and we now turn in your hymnal to page 498, 499, and we're going to look again at two texts paired together. The first is Carl Sandburg's a Lincoln Preface, and the second will be the John McGee text, Arthur Ashe Remembered. Now, at 2b, and it's there for you on page 498, what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be comparing a couple of biographical pieces of writing. Let's get this one out of the way really quickly, because sometimes freshmen will say, dude, what's the difference between autobiography and biography? It's very simple. About both of them, it's writing about a life. So write that down. Autobiography, biography, both of them writing about a life, something that happened, okay? Autobiography simply means that you write about your own life. So if you're telling anything that happened to you yourself, you are actually translating or telling an autobiographical incident, okay? If you do it in writing, again, we call it an autobiographical essay or piece of writing or whatever. If, however, your friend or enemy writes something about you, or somebody else writes something about you, or tells something about you, that's biography. In other words, I'm telling somebody else I'm telling you about somebody else. That's biography. So we're going to look at two pieces of writing. In other words, Carl Sandburg's not going to be writing about himself. That would be autobiographic. Carl Sandburg is going to be telling about the great 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Okay? John McGee is going to not be talking about, McGee is not going to be talking about himself. He's going to be talking about one of the greatest tennis players of all time, a guy named Arthur Ashe. Do you got me? Now, having said that, though, let's put this in our notes. It's always been pointed out that when you look at biography, the person telling about the other person, in this case, for example, Carl Sandburg, telling about Arthur Ashe, inevitably is going to say something about himself or herself. It's kind of an inevitability because there's all this stuff that happens in a lifetime. Why choose certain things to talk about and not other things to talk about? Why be silent on certain things and talk about other things? Well, in the very choosing to talk about another person's life, you are inevitably saying something about yourself. So there's always been this interesting case study about what is being exposed or talked about when a person writes one of these biographies. Now, we're going to be looking at biographical writing, and there it is on 498, from a few perspectives. For example, we're going to pay attention important elements. One will be subject, who are writing about, talking about, reading about. Another will be the writer-subject connection. In other words, the biographer usually has some kind of intense interest, and that's what I was referencing before. Why is certain things selected and other things de-emphasized or whatever? Of course, let's put this in our notes. This is huge. To write about another person, you have to do some form of research. You got to find out about them. Right? Now, if those people are still alive, you obviously can go and ask them. But if they're no longer alive, then you got to do all kinds of archival study. Like, for example, if you're going to write about somebody that's now dead, you're going to have to go and find out about them. If they're recently dead, you can obviously ask people who knew them, right? Well, for example, we've just had a rash, for example, of several important musicians who have died, either of their own choosing or somebody else's choosing, right? If you wanted to write a biography about them, well, recently if they've died, you can go and start talking to people who knew them. Of course, what immediately is the problem with that? Well, did they like them or did they not like them? Because you're going to get interesting information depending on whether they liked them or not liked them. If they were their friend, they're going to say certain things about them. If they're their enemy, they're going to say different kinds of things about them. And you, the one writing the biography, have to try and figure out. Of course, the theory is, what you're trying to do is to present, notice, Unit 3, non-fiction. In other words, you're going to argue that what you're presenting is in fact true, that it really happened. But of course, this is problematic if you weren't there to actually witness it, right? And so research is really important. The arguments of research are usually that you try to find multiple sources to validate what you're saying. Right? So in other words, if 3 or 4 or 5 people say it, you can begin to go, well, maybe it's true. Of course, you could quickly point out that is not always true. Well, in high school, you can easily find 3 or 4 or 5 people that say I did something that I did never do. right? I mean, that happens all the time. As a matter of fact, you can say you can line up 500 people that say I did something. Doesn't make it true. Why? Because especially in the age of social media, one person can post something and 4 or 5 other people immediately know it and start sharing it. It's not true, but it's shared. So the research component, dude, this is really hard to do, which is what makes writing biography such a big time deal, right? Because it's not easy to do. Finally, of course, and this is huge, interpretation. You want to write that one down. Well, what does that mean? Well, you might find out that the person you're interested in and you're writing about actually did X. Okay, they did something. X, we'll call it. But what does it mean that they did X? How do you interpret that action? Because you can't go up to them if they're not alive anymore and go, dude, why did you do that? And even if they are alive, sometimes you can ask them why they did it, and the individual that you're researching will sometimes give you a bogus answer, right? So interpretation is always huge, which is why writing biography is kind of like problem solving or make a puzzle of a kind, because you've got all these events that the individual did, and then you're always asking, like, what led them to do this or to do that? That's always part of the dynamics, right? They got a chart for you that kind of helps you with this type of thing between Lincoln and Ash. Notice personality, upbringing, relationships, life events, role in major events, influence on others. Do you see that chart at the bottom of 498? All of that will help you in the readings of both of these. On 499, we've got our big question, is knowledge the same thing as understanding or wisdom? And we're obviously going to play that game again, right? Let's meet Carl Sandburg, the one that we'll be studying first here, the author of A Lincoln Preface. First start with his dates, 1878 to 1967. So you can see the dates there. Look at the life that he lived, the time that he lived through, right? Between the ages of 13 and 20, Sandburg worked as a porter, scene changer, truck handler, dishwasher, and farm worker. Now, I will tell you, we're going to study more Sandburg in your junior year when we see him as one of the great American poets. We're not looking, however, to Sandburg as a great poet today. We're looking at him rather as a biographer. But let's put this in our notes right away. Sandburg lived himself a remarkably full life. And because he did all of these different things, he was able to write well about all different facets of life. Look at that list of all those jobs that he did. You know what I'm saying? The more different jobs you do, the more different kinds of people you contact, the more you're able to kind of write about a person, okay? Sandburg served briefly in Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, which brought on the strong anti-war feelings he would hold throughout his life. So let's put this in our notes. Sandburg is one of the great pacifists in the American literary tradition. In other words, he has some serious issues with going to war and fighting. One of the reasons is because he himself was in a war and he saw people fighting and dying. Childhood favorite. Even as a child, Sandburg was fascinated by Abraham Lincoln. For 30, are you reading this with me? For 30 years, he collected material about Lincoln. It took him 30 years of homework. I mean, I had freshmen that say, dude, 3 nights and I'm dead. 30 years he collected information on President Abraham Lincoln to write this famous text. His single-mindedness paid off. Sandburg's 6-volume work about Lincoln is considered the definitive biography. 6 volumes of 30 years of work. Now, we're not reading, obviously, the entire thing. Notice on page 500, you have the word from a Lincoln preface, okay? So, right away, we're just getting a cutting from this. Your textbook company has decided that, A, you need to be exposed to this work of Sandburg, but obviously, you can't read it all. So, B, we're going to give you just a few lines of this thing, okay? However, there is some background information. Read it with me, page 501, at the top of the page. Ever since the birth of the United States in 1776, the issue of slavery had troubled the nation. Each time a new state entered the Union, Congress debated fiercely over whether it would be a slave-holding or a free state. In 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, he refused to support any congressional proposal that would allow for new slave states. The southern slave-holding states resolved to fight to keep new states open to slavery. And of course, this conflict led to the outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861. So you got, of course, Lincoln as one of the most important, many have said, the most important president. Why? Because he lived in a really important time in American history when literally America divided. It literally divided and went to war against itself. That's why we call it a civil war. Of course, Lincoln himself calling it that. Now, one other comment. In your junior year, we will study more closely Lincoln and his Gettysburg Address. And of course, the history as well in American history of the American Civil War. Our focus right now is the biography information about this guy named Abraham Lincoln. So let's go ahead now, follow along. And when we finish, I'm going to ask you this question, so write it down. When we finish, I'm going to ask you this. What is it that our writer here, Carl Sandburg, most emphasizes about Abraham Lincoln? What does he consider to be the most important thing about Abraham Lincoln? Okay, of course, I'm obviously going to ask you at 3B, what do you find most interesting about Abraham Lincoln? In other words, what's one thing you didn't know before? I mean, there's a picture of him on page 500, right? And everybody's seen a picture of this person, right? And everybody kind of knows a little bit about this 16th president of the United States and the fact that, of course, he was assassinated at the end of his presidency and all of that, right? What we want to ask is, what's one new thing you learned that you didn't know before that leads you to respect him in ways that you didn't before? All right, here we go. Let's pay close attention now. Carl Sandburg and his views on, his comments on Lincoln, okay? I apologize.
A Lincoln Preface by Carl Sandburg. In the time of the April lilacs in the year 1865, a man in the city of Washington, D.C. trusted a guard to watch at a door. And the guard was careless, left the door. And the man was shot, lingered a night, passed away, was laid in a box, and carried north and west 1,000 miles. Bells sobbed. Cities wore crepe. People stood with hats off as the railroad burial car came past at midnight, dawn, or noon. During the 4 years of time before he gave up the ghost, this man was clothed with despotic power, commanding the most powerful armies till then assembled in modern warfare, enforcing drafts of soldiers, abolishing the right of habeas corpus, directing politically and spiritually the wild, massive forces loosed in civil war. $4 billion worth of property was taken from those who had been legal owners of it, confiscated, wiped out as by fire at his instigation and executive direction. A class of chattel property recognized as lawful for 200 years went to the scrap pile. When the woman who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin came to see him in the White House, he greeted her, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." And as they seated themselves at a fireplace, "I do love an open fire. I always had one at home." As they were finishing their talk of the days of blood, he said, "I shan't last long after it's over." An Illinois congressman looked in on him as he had his face lathered for a shave in the White House, and remarked, "If anybody had told me that in a great crisis like this the people were going out to a little one-horse town and pick out a one-horse lawyer for president, I wouldn't have believed it." The answer was, "Neither would I. But it was a time when a man with a policy would have been fatal to the country. I never had a policy. I have simply tried to do what seemed best each day as each day came. I don't intend precisely to throw the Constitution overboard, but I will stick it in a hole if I can," he told a cabinet officer. The enemy was violating the Constitution to destroy the Union, he argued, and therefore, I will violate the Constitution if necessary to save the Union. He instructed a messenger to the Secretary of the Treasury, "Tell him not to bother himself about the Constitution. Say that I have that great sacred instrument here at the White House, and I am guarding it with great care." When he was renominated, it was by the device of seating delegates from Tennessee, which gave enough added votes to seat favorable delegates from Kentucky, Missouri, Louisiana, Arkansas, and from one county in Florida. Until late in that campaign of 1864, he expected to lose the November election. Military victories brought the tide his way. The vote was 2,200,000 for him and 1,800,000 against him. Among those who bitterly fought him politically and accused him of blunders or crimes were Franklin Pierce, a former president of the United States, Horatio Seymour, the governor of New York, Samuel F.B. Morse, inventor of the telegraph, Cyrus H. McCormick, inventor of the farm reaper, General George B. McClellan, a Democrat who had commanded the Army of the Potomac, and the Chicago Times, a daily newspaper. In all its essential propositions, the Southern Confederacy had the moral support of powerful, respectable elements throughout the North, probably more than 1 million voters believing in the justice of the cause of the South as compared with the North. While propagandists raged and the war winds howled, he sat in the White House, the stubborn man of history, writing that the Mississippi was one river and could not belong to two countries, that the plans for railroad connections from coast to coast must be pushed through and the Union Pacific realized. His life, mind, and heart ran on contrasts. When his white kid gloves broke into tatters while shaking hands at a White House reception, he remarked, "This looks like a general bustification." When he talked with an Ohio friend one day during the 1864 campaign, he mentioned one public man and murmured, "He's a thistle. I don't see why God lets him live." Of a devious senator, he said, "He's too crooked to lie still." And of a New York editor, "In early life in the West, we used to make our shoes last a great while with much mending, and sometimes when far gone, we found the leather so rotten the stitches would not hold. Greeley is so rotten that nothing can be done with him. He is not truthful. The stitches all tear out." As he sat in the telegraph office of the War Department, reading cipher dispatches, and came to the words "Hosanna" and "husband," he would chuckle "Jeffy D," and at the words "Hunter" and "Happy," "Bobby Lee." While the luck of war wavered and broke and came again, as generals failed and campaigns were lost, he held enough forces of the Union together to raise new armies and supply them, until generals were found who made war as victorious war has always been made, with terror, frightfulness, destruction, and valor and sacrifice past words of man to tell. A slouching, gray-headed poet, haunting the hospitals at Washington, characterized him as the grandest figure on the crowded canvas of the drama of the 19th century, a Hoosier Michelangelo. His own speeches, letters, telegrams,
504.
and official messages during that war form the most significant and enduring document from any one man on why the war began, why it went on, and the dangers beyond its end. He mentioned the politicians, over and again, the politicians, with scorn and blame. As the platoons filed before him at a review of an Army Corps, he asked, "What is to become of these boys when the war is over?" He was a chosen spokesman, yet there were times he was silent. Nothing but silence could at those times have fitted a chosen spokesman. In the mixed shame and blame of the immense wrongs of two crashing civilizations, with nothing to say, he said nothing, slept not at all, and wept at those times in a way that made weeping appropriate, decent, majestic. His hat was shot off as he rode alone one night in Washington. A son he loved died as he watched at the bed. His wife was accused of betraying information to the enemy until denials from him were necessary. His best companion was a fine-hearted and brilliant son with a deformed palate and an impediment of speech. When a Pennsylvania congressman told him the enemy had declared they would break into the city and hang him to a lamp post, he said he had considered the violent preliminaries to such a scene. On his left thumb was a scar where an axe had nearly chopped the thumb off when he was a boy. Over one eye was a scar where he had been hit with a club in the hands of a man trying to steal the cargo off a Mississippi River flatboat. He threw a cashiered officer out of his room in the White House, crying, "I can bear censure, but not insult. I never wish to see your face again." As he shook hands with the correspondent of the London Times, he drawled, "Well, I guess the London Times is about the greatest power on earth, unless perhaps it is the Mississippi River." He rebuked with anger a woman who got on her knees to thank him for a pardon that saved her son from being shot at sunrise. And when an Iowa woman said she had journeyed out of her way to Washington just for a look at him, he grinned, "Well, in the matter of looking at one another, I have altogether the advantage." He asked his cabinet to vote on the high military command, and after the vote told them the appointment had already been made. One cabinet officer, who had been governor of Ohio, came away personally baffled and frustrated from an interview to exclaim to a private secretary, "That man is the most cunning person I ever saw in my life." An Illinois lawyer who had been sent on errands carrying his political secrets said, "He is a trimmer, and such a trimmer as the world has never seen. He manipulated the admission of Nevada as a state in the Union when her votes were needed for the Emancipation Proclamation, saying it is easier to admit Nevada than to raise another million of soldiers. At the same time, he went to the office of a former New York editor who had become Assistant Secretary of War and said the votes of 3 congressmen were wanted for the required 3/4 of votes in the House of Representatives, advising, there are 3 that you can deal with better than anybody else. Whatever promise you make to those men, I will perform it." And in the same week, he said to a Massachusetts politician that 2 votes were lacking, and those 2 votes must be procured. I leave it to you to determine how it shall be done. But remember that I am President of the United States and clothed with immense power, and I expect you to procure those votes. And while he was thus employing every last resource and device of practical politics to constitutionally abolish slavery, the abolitionist Henry Ward Beecher attacked him with javelins of scorn and detestation in a series of editorials that brought from him the single comment, "Is thy servant a dog?" When the king of Siam sent him a costly sword of exquisite embellishment and 2 elephant tusks, along with letters and a photograph of the king, he acknowledged the gifts in a manner as lavish as the Orientals. Addressing the king of Siam as great and good friend, he wrote thanks for each of the gifts, including also 2 elephant tusks of length and magnitude such as indicate they could have belonged only to an animal which was a native of Siam. After further